In December 2025, 3 prisoners were executed in the United States. In this video, we will walk through the crimes that put them on death row, the final words they spoke, and the last meals they requested before facing execution. But before we start, let us know in the comments where you are watching this from. The first one was scheduled for December 9th. After spending more than 35 years on death row, Mark Athen Walls was executed by lethal injection in Florida. But what did he do? It was just after 3:15 in the afternoon on February 1st, 1989, when 8-year-old Bart Pettibone came home from school. But this time, something felt wrong. His mother's car wasn't in the driveway as usual, and the front door was locked. He used his key to go through the carport door and cautiously walked toward the house. He left his books just inside the door, took off his shoes, and walked into the kitchen, still expecting to see his mother there. But what he saw would stay with him forever. His mother, 33-year-old Tressa Lynn Pettibone, was lying on the kitchen floor. Her hands were bound with plastic ties and blood pooled around her. She wasn't moving, and there was far too much blood for Bart to understand. For a long moment, he couldn't make sense of what he was seeing. Then panic hit. At the same moment, a car pulled up outside. It was Kelly Strassiner, a family friend who came to drop off Bart's older sister Blythe from school. Bart ran to her to tell her what he saw, and Kelly followed him inside, her heart pounding before she even saw the scene. As soon as she stepped inside, she turned around and hurried the children back out, shielding them from the doorway, from the sight no child should ever see. She took them to a friend's house from where she called the police, but by the time police and paramedics arrived, it was already too late. The Pettibone home, once a quiet house on a quiet street, had now become the scene of a brutal murder. Officers stepped into a kitchen that showed signs of a fight. There were bloodstains on the floor, and a knife sat in the sink, resting on a blue washcloth like someone had tried to clean it. A plastic zip tie, just like the one found around Tressa's wrists, was lying nearby. Detectives started bagging evidence, unsure of who could have done something like this to a mother of 2. The medical examiner later confirmed that Tressa had been beaten and stabbed several times. One wound to the neck had cut deep enough to sever her carotid artery. She would have lost consciousness within minutes. But before that, she had been alive long enough for bruising to form, proof that she had fought her attacker with all she had left. Back in the house, detectives quickly realized some things were missing. Drawers had been pulled open, and jewelry boxes were left half empty. Several pieces of jewelry were gone: a diamond necklace, 2 gold herringbone chains, a man's ring and watch, and a few pairs of earrings that Tressa often wore. The small red-framed Bucci sunglasses she loved were gone too, and so was her car. To investigators, it looked less like a random break-in and more like someone who had known exactly what to take. And one thing became clear: whoever did this wasn't a stranger. There were no signs of forced entry, no shattered windows, and no kicked-in doors. The killer had either been invited in or had let himself in with full confidence. And that raised the question: who would have known exactly where to go and what to take? Over the next few days, investigators pieced together a list of everyone who might have had access to the home. And one name stood out: Mark Athen Walls. A year before the murder, 20-year-old Mark had worked inside the Pettibone home. He was a local carpenter who did odd jobs around Panama City Beach. For months, he had helped remodel the family's house, fixing cabinets, hanging doors, and sanding trim. By early 1989, the job was long finished, and Tressa hadn't seen Mark in months. But one afternoon, about a week before the killing, she and her 2 children, Bart and Blythe, ran into him at the mall. They were standing at a cinnamon roll stand when they bumped into each other. Mark asked how the family was doing, how the house held up, and if they might have some work for him coming up, since he could really use the money. Tressa told him that her husband was away for business at the moment, but they would discuss it after he got back. And that was all Mark needed to know. Later that same day, he spotted Bart again in the mall arcade and he walked over to talk to him. He didn't ask about school or baseball or anything a kid might expect. Instead, he asked Bart when his father was coming home, what time he and his sister left for school, and when they usually came back. At the time, Bart didn't think anything of it. But looking back, those questions weren't random. They were calculated, carefully gathering details for what would come next. In the days after the murder, detectives began closing in on Mark. The case was built on circumstantial evidence, but it was strong, and it was stacking up fast. Just hours after Tressa was killed, Mark had walked into a pawn shop in Panama City Beach. He laid a gold herringbone necklace on the counter, the same kind Tressa's daughter said her mother always wore, and the pawn ticket had Mark's name on it. When police later tested a reddish stain on that necklace, the lab confirmed it was blood matching Tressa's blood type. This was enough to move quickly. Officers arrested Mark on February 3, 1989, 2 days after the attack on Tressa. At first, he claimed he was innocent. He said he had been working on a fiberglass boat that day and had stopped by his grandfather's house to shower. His grandfather, Douglas Freeman, confirmed that Mark had come around 11:30 that morning to take a shower. But he also told the police that he was carrying gloves, a pair of red sunglasses, and a bag. Bit by bit, the evidence began to close in. Investigators had found bloody shoe prints on the floor of the Pettibone kitchen, and lab analysis showed they matched a pair of Nike soles. When they searched Mark's home, they found Nike shoes with the same tread pattern. But the match didn't stop there. Inside his car, detectives found plastic zip ties that looked just like the ones used to bind Tressa's wrists. And when they searched the house again, they found more of the same type. Around that time, a woman named Vicky Ward came forward. She said Mark had given her a pair of red Bucci sunglasses, and they looked just like the ones Tressa's family said were missing from her home. But what exactly happened that afternoon? That day, Tressa had been home doing chores when Mark showed up at her door, and she let him in. From that point forward, the rest had to be pieced together from the crime scene, signs of a struggle, a violent attack, and a missing car that turned up abandoned at a nearby school. By the time police found the stolen Mercedes, Mark had already started pawning her jewelry for cash. Once arrested, he was charged with first-degree murder, armed robbery, and burglary. And the trial that followed became one of the most publicized cases in Bay County's history. Reporters flooded the courtroom, and newspapers called him the Carpenter Killer. Yet his story didn't end there. Weeks before his trial, he had tried to run. One January night, he broke out of the Bay County jail and disappeared for more than a day before police caught him just a few miles away. The escape only made things worse. The newspapers called him a danger to the public, and the prosecution used it to argue he had no respect for the law. During his trial in 1990, prosecutors told the jury that Mark's motive was simple: money. He knew Tressa's husband was away and thought she would be an easy target. But when she resisted, he turned violent. They said the way she was tied up, the way the scene was staged, showed control and planning. But Mark's lawyers argued something different. They said he was a troubled man who had grown up in a strict and divided home. His parents had divorced when he was young, and he had drifted from job to job, never finding stability. They told jurors that while he may have stolen, he didn't mean to kill anyone, that what happened in there was panic, not premeditation. They pointed out that he hadn't even brought a weapon with him that day. He had taken a knife from the kitchen, a sign, they said, that violence was never part of his plan. But the jury didn't believe this, and after just a few hours of deliberation, they found Mark guilty of first-degree murder. Later, at sentencing, they recommended death, and the judge agreed. On April 17, 1990, he sentenced Mark Athen Walls to die in Florida's electric chair. For the next 35 years, Mark sat on death row at Florida State Prison, and like so many others, he fought his sentence from behind bars, appeal after appeal, year after year. He claimed his trial had been unfair, that jurors were biased because of the media coverage, and that evidence had been mishandled. He even argued that his childhood and mental health should have spared him from execution. But every appeal ended the same way. The courts reviewed the evidence, the jewelry, the blood, the pawn slip, the matching shoe prints, and turned him down. Then, in 2025, the fight was finally over when the Florida Supreme Court signed his death warrant. He was scheduled to die on December 9, 2025. That morning, Mark woke up at 5:45 a.m. inside Florida State Prison. Like every inmate facing execution, he was given the option to request a special final meal, but he turned it down. According to the prison spokesperson, no visitors came to see him, and he also chose not to meet with a spiritual advisor. So, in those final hours, Mark Geralds faced the end completely alone, quietly, and with no one by his side. Just before 6 p.m., he was led to the execution chamber. When asked if he had any final words, Mark spoke directly to someone in the viewing room. "I'm sorry that I missed you," he said softly. Then he added, "I loved you every day." No one was sure exactly who he was speaking to, but his words hung in the room with a quiet weight. When the injection began, he took several deep breaths, his chest rising and falling as the drugs took effect. There were a few moments of slight movement, small twitches, his mouth opening and closing. And then he gradually grew still. Within 3 to 4 minutes, Mark showed no further movement. He was pronounced dead at 6:15 p.m. Mark Athen Walls was 58 years old. Just 2 days later, the next execution took place, this time in Tennessee. On December 11, 2025, after spending more than 35 years on death row, Harold Wayne Nichols was executed by lethal injection. Let's take a look at what he did to end up there. It was just before midnight on Friday, September 30th, 1988, when 28-year-old Wayne pulled up and parked a short distance from a quiet house in the Brainerd neighborhood of Chattanooga. Inside that house were 3 women, 21-year-old Karen Elise Pulley and her 2 roommates. Wayne knew that. From the darkness, he watched the house closely until he saw one of her roommates get dressed and leave the house. That was the moment he had been waiting for. He stepped out of his car, grabbed a short piece of lumber, a 2x4, and crept toward the home. He found a way in through a small bathroom window, and once inside, he moved through the hallway without making a sound, the board gripped tight in his hand. Upstairs, Karen was still asleep. She had no idea that someone had broken in and that danger was just seconds away. Wayne slipped into her room and attacked without warning, slamming the board into her head. She woke in panic and tried to fight him off, but he overpowered her, tore at her clothes, and her. After he was done, he hit her again and again until she stopped moving. Then he took whatever he could find and left the house, leaving Karen barely alive and bleeding on her bedroom floor. The next morning, one of Karen's roommates returned to the house and stepped into a nightmare. She found Karen laying on the floor, clinging to life and surrounded by blood. Paramedics rushed her to the hospital, but it was too late. She never regained consciousness and died the next day. But who had done this, and why? While investigators were still gathering details from the attack on Karen, Wayne was already planning his next move. It was just after midnight on October 20th, 1988, when he struck again, this time in Tiftonia, a quiet neighborhood on the edge of Chattanooga. Inside one of the houses, a 23-year-old woman was finishing her bedtime routine. Her husband worked late shifts, and she had just unlocked the side door so he could come in when he got home. But she didn't know that small act of routine would leave her defenseless. Only 15 minutes passed before Wayne found the door. He let himself in, silent and deliberate, like he had done it before. He picked up a heavy brass candlestick from a table and crept toward the bedroom. The woman didn't even have time to scream. The first strike split the skin on her head, and the second one dropped her to the floor. She tried to crawl, dazed and bleeding, but he threatened to kill her if she didn't stay quiet. Then he wrapped his hands around her throat and strangled her until she could no longer resist, but didn't kill her. After that, he raped her. When it was over, he told her not to move. Terrified, she knelt on the edge of the bed, barely breathing, afraid to even look up. And that's where her husband found her, shaking in the dark when he got home from work. He immediately called the police, but the nightmare wasn't over. While officers were still there collecting evidence, the phone rang. The woman answered it and froze. She recognized the voice instantly. It was him. But before she could respond, she broke and handed the phone to a nearby officer. But by then, the line had already gone quiet. And that was only the beginning. Between the fall of 1988 and early 1989, Wayne terrorized Chattanooga with a string of home invasions and violent assaults. He broke into the homes of at least 11 women. Some he had watched for days, others for weeks. He came armed with knives, cords, or whatever he could turn into a weapon. And once inside, he controlled every second, threatening, beating, and the women, sometimes forcing them to shower afterward or change clothes at his demand. He always left with something and always disappeared before the police arrived. Every attack followed the same brutal script. For 3 long months, detectives chased every lead. They spoke to over 100 people, ran fingerprint comparisons, processed biological evidence, and tried to connect the dots. But the case went nowhere. They had no suspects and didn't even know what weapon had been used to attack Karen. But everything changed on a Thursday night in January 1989. At exactly 8:10 p.m., East Ridge Police Captain Larry Holland picked up a call that broke the case wide open. It was an anonymous tip from a man later identified as Chuck Mull. He gave them a name and a date of birth, leading them straight to Wayne. Chuck said that this was the man they were looking for. He was behind the that had been terrorizing Chattanooga for months. And the officers listening knew they had to move fast. Within minutes, detectives ran Wayne's record and found a 1984 conviction for burglary and attempted rape. The pattern fit too well to dismiss. They pulled his photo and showed it to 4 of his potential victims. One by one, each woman pointed to the same face without hesitation. This was the man who attacked them, and the warrant for his arrest was signed that same night. By 11:06 p.m., police surrounded his house. Wayne was arrested and taken to the East Ridge station, where he waived his rights without blinking. And less than an hour later, the confessions started pouring out. On video, Wayne confessed to 4 of the rapes. But this wasn't enough for the detectives, and the questioning went on until dawn. By morning, Wayne was giving up even more names, more attacks. Some of them hadn't even been reported yet. It was becoming clear that he had harmed far more women than anyone had realized. That same evening, more victims came in to view lineups. Every single one of them recognized his face. And when they questioned him again, he finally mentioned Karen. On camera, he explained how he had broken into her room, attacked her, and left her bleeding on the floor. The case that had haunted investigators for months now had a face. And just hours later, he led them to a vacant lot in East Ridge, showing them the spot where he had ditched the 2x4 used to crush her skull. And just 2 days after that, his own wife came forward saying Wayne had told her everything. By February 1st, 1989, the state charged him with Karen Pulley's rape and murder, and soon more charges followed, one for nearly every woman he had attacked. And when psychologists examined him that summer, they confirmed what the evidence already made clear. He was fully competent, and he knew exactly what he had done. The trial for Karen's murder began on May 7, 1990, in Hamilton County. But because the case had already received heavy media coverage, jurors were brought in from Sumner County to avoid any local bias. Before things got underway, Wayne's attorneys tried to block the jury from seeing his taped confession, but the court denied that motion. And once that happened, Wayne gave up any effort to fight the charges. He pled guilty to first-degree murder, aggravated and burglary. The judge accepted his plea without hesitation, and with that, the trial moved straight to the sentencing phase. And prosecutors wasted no time making their stance known. They would seek the death penalty for the murder of Karen. Their case focused on two aggravating factors: that the murder occurred during a sexual assault, and that Wayne already had a history of violent felony convictions. That combination, they argued, made him a continued threat. For the first time, jurors heard the full scope of what happened that night. Not just Wayne's own words, but the brutal details that followed. Paramedics, police officers, and Karen's roommates all took the stand, recounting the scene they had walked into, a small bedroom turned into a nightmare. One of the paramedics, William Craig, took the stand and described a scene that even his years in Vietnam hadn't prepared him for. He told the jury how Karen's skull was so badly crushed that he thought she was a child when he first saw her. He had responded to countless emergencies, but nothing compared to what he saw that night. Karen's roommates followed, each one adding more weight to the nightmare. They talked about the house they had shared, the normalcy of that evening, and how it shattered in an instant. Then came the videotaped confession. The jury sat in silence as Wayne walked investigators through everything that had happened, and police followed up with a recreation of his path through the house, guided by his own words. Finally, the medical examiner, Dr. Frank King, explained the brutality of the attack in clear clinical terms. He described the multiple fractures, the torn tissue, the amount of force required to inflict them, and confirmed that a 2x4 was likely the weapon. He also told the jury that the sexual assault Karen suffered had been her first experience, and that the damage to her body required a level of force beyond what anyone should endure. Each witness added to the same unshakable truth, the horror of that night, and the man responsible. But when the prosecution stepped back, the defense stepped forward with something else, a picture of a man, not a monster. Wayne's wife, Joanne, took the stand and called him kind, gentle even. She said that recently, Wayne worked long shifts and sometimes never came home until morning. She had told herself it was overtime or bad hours at the restaurant. And even when Wayne admitted to her what he did to Karen, calling it an accident, she still couldn't believe him. Nothing she knew about him suggested he was capable of something like that. Others followed. Pastors, friends, and neighbors described him as soft-spoken, remorseful, someone who had been overtaken by something darker. One preacher claimed an evil spirit had taken control of Wayne, while another insisted he was still a good person somewhere beneath the surface. And when Wayne took the stand, he didn't try to deny what happened. Instead, he opened a window into the past, back to when he was just 10 years old and lost his mother to cancer. One day, he was a boy living at home. The next, his father dropped him off at an orphanage without saying why. He said he didn't remember much from those years, only fragments, different adults coming and going, and people he bonded with disappearing without warning. And just when he was about to be adopted, he said, they changed their mind and sent him back to his father. But that return didn't bring comfort. It brought arguments, distance, and a father who didn't seem to know what to do with him. He enlisted in the Army, hoping structure and discipline might fix what felt broken. And for a while it seemed to work. He earned an honorable discharge in 1984, something he carried with pride. 2 years later, he married Joanne. They built a life together that he thought was worth holding on to, even when things got hard. He took a job at Godfather's Pizza and didn't just clock in and out. He worked his way up from cook to assistant manager. He kept up with child support for a daughter from an earlier relationship. And on paper, it looked like he was finally getting it right. But then he described the nights when something inside him snapped, when his mind would go blank and all that remained was something he called a strange, energized feeling. A rush that blocked out everything, reason, fear, even guilt, until violence was the only thing left on his mind. He said he didn't want it, didn't understand it, and couldn't stop it once it started. And yet, he never asked anyone for help. He never warned Joanne, He never tried to get treatment, and he carried the secret alone until the night everything collapsed. Wayne insisted he never meant to kill Karen, but when he was pressed, he admitted that if he hadn't been caught, he would have kept going. Psychologist Dr. Eric Engum was the last to testify. He called Wayne's condition intermittent explosive disorder, describing a man who bottled up rage until it burst into violence. He spoke of a boy shaped by loss, a father who punished harshly, a mother who died without warning, and caretakers who disappeared one by one. All that pain, he said, had turned inward until it finally erupted. But for the jury, none of it could undo what Wayne had done to Karen. On the morning of May 12, 1990, the jury returned with their verdict. After only 2 hours of deliberation, their decision was final. Harold Wayne Nichols would die for what he had done to Karen. The verdict form carried 4 reasons: the deliberate, calculated killing of Karen, the sheer brutality of it, his complete lack of remorse, and finally, the absence of even the most basic respect for human life. The jury was unanimous. They agreed that the weight of those aggravating factors crushed any attempt at mercy. Beyond a reasonable doubt, they found no reason to spare his life. Wayne was also convicted in 5 separate rape cases involving 4 women. For each conviction, he received long prison sentences, decades behind bars that would have kept him locked away for the rest of his life, even without the death penalty. But still, for more than 35 years, Wayne fought to stay alive. His lawyers launched appeal after appeal, claiming childhood trauma, psychological disorders, and years of emotional neglect should have spared him from execution. But every court that reviewed his case saw the same thing: a man who had confessed in detail to a brutal murder and a string of violent rapes. The evidence was overwhelming, and mercy never came. Instead of mercy, he got a date: December 11, 2025. Under Tennessee law, inmates convicted before 1999 could choose between the electric chair or lethal injection. But Wayne refused to pick either. So by default, the state chose lethal injection, the method he had avoided for years. Back in 2020, when his execution was first scheduled, he chose the electric chair, maybe thinking it would be quicker, maybe more certain. But before that day ever came, the pandemic swept across the country and shut nearly everything down. Executions paused, courtrooms emptied, and his death warrant expired before it could be carried out. Over the years, Wayne slowly built a different life than the one that brought him there. His clemency petition on November 7th painted a picture of a man who settled into the routine of a maximum security unit, and over time became the inmate who kept the place steadier. He had grown into someone the officers trusted when things turned tense, someone who stepped in before fights broke out. He mentored younger inmates, helped diffuse conflicts, and spoke to at-risk teens during scared straight tours, hoping to steer them off the path that had destroyed his own life. He wasn't just doing time, he was trying to rewrite who he was on the outside. But according to the petition, that change didn't begin inside a cell. It started the moment the jury sealed his fate. Right after the judge read the verdict, Karen Pulley's mother, Ann, had asked to speak to him. They sat across from each other, Wayne in shackles, and still in shock, yet what she offered wasn't anger. She talked to him about faith, about forgiveness, about saving what little of him might still be saved. His attorney, Rosemarie Bryan, watched the two of them cry together, and later said it felt like Ann was trying to save this kid's soul. Ann met with him twice more before he was moved out of the county jail. On one visit, she handed him a Bible. He wasn't much for reading, but he took it anyway, and he kept it. For 35 years, it stayed with him through every move, every lockdown, every solitary stretch in that 6x9 cell. Those early conversations grew into a quiet determination to do better with the life he had left. The petition included statements from former officers and volunteers who had watched him for years. One of them, former Correction Lieutenant Tony Eden, said Wayne was one of the warmest and kindest inmates he had ever supervised. He remembered him as a steadying force, calm, respectful, and the kind of inmate others followed. Another former officer, Hugh Rushton, described him the same way. A leader, someone who pushed other men to improve themselves, not just survive their time. All of it, Anne's forgiveness, the Bible she placed in his hands, the decades spent inside, became the foundation of the argument that Wayne wasn't the same man who walked into Karen Pulley's home all those years ago. But it wasn't enough. The date stood. Like most prisoners on death row, Harold was given the chance to request a final meal. In Tennessee, inmates are typically granted $20 for whatever they choose, and Harold knew exactly what he wanted. He asked for beef brisket, coleslaw, a baked potato, onion rings, deviled eggs, and cheese biscuits, all washed down with fruit tea. For the families affected, the wait has been agonizing. In a recent interview, Karen's sister said the decades that followed her sister's murder have been 37 years of hell. She remembered her sister as gentle, sweet, and innocent, and said she hoped that once the execution is behind them, she will finally be able to focus on the good memories, not the horror of what happened. On the morning of December 11, 2025, Wayne was led into the execution chamber. When asked if he had any final words, he spoke calmly and with emotion. "To the people I've harmed, I'm sorry. To my family, know that I love you. To my friends, I love each one of you. I know where I'm going. I'm ready to go home." At 10:25 a.m., the curtain to the witness room opened. Wayne lay on the gurney, wearing a yellow prison suit and his thick black glasses. His arms were stretched out, a sheet pulled neatly to his waist as the medical team completed their preparations. Wayne's sister sat in the witness room, visibly shaken as the process began. His spiritual advisor stood beside him, offering quiet words of comfort. A minute later, the advisor began reading from the Bible. He paused several times, his voice breaking with emotion. Wayne tapped his foot lightly as he listened. By 10:29 a.m., Wayne was nodding and blinking slowly. A minute later, his breathing deepened and grew heavier, causing his mustache to move as the drugs took effect. His breaths gradually slowed, and his face changed in color from red to purple as his body became still. Just minutes later, the blinds closed. At 10:39 a.m., he was officially pronounced dead. Harold Wayne Nichols was 64 years old. Let's continue with the last person executed in 2025. On December 18, 2025, after spending more than 37 years on death row, Frank Athen Walls was executed by lethal injection in Florida. But what led him to death row? Let's take a look. It began in the early hours of July 22, 1987, when 20-year-old Frank broke into a neighbor's mobile home in Okaloosa County. The house was dark and quiet as he moved down the hallway, but then, on purpose, he knocked over a small fan. It toppled over and hit the floor hard, loud enough to wake the people sleeping inside. Frank froze and waited in the darkness. In the back bedroom, 22-year-old Air Force Airman Edward Alger and his girlfriend, 20-year-old Ann Louise Peterson, jolted awake. And when they stepped into the hallway to check the noise, Frank quickly took control. He forced Ann to restrain Edward's wrists and ankles with a curtain cord. And once Edward was tied, Frank turned his attention to Ann, restraining her as well. For a moment, it seemed like Frank believed he had complete control of the situation. But that didn't last long. Edward managed to free himself, and the moment the cord slipped, he lunged at Frank. The two crashed into walls and door frames, and Frank reached for the knife he had brought. He swung once and cut Edward across the throat, but Edward didn't go down. Instead, he knocked the knife out of Frank's hand and bit down on Frank's leg with everything he had. In the chaos, Frank pulled out a gun and fired until Edward stopped moving. Shaken by what had happened, Frank removed Ann's gag and tried to speak to her. He told her he never meant for things to go this far. He said none of it had been planned and that everything had slipped out of his control. His words sounded frantic, almost desperate, as if he was trying to convince himself as much as her. But his actions told a different story. What followed was a final, devastating betrayal. He started to rape Anne, and after he was done, he grabbed his gun once again and shot her once. When she started to scream, he pushed her face into a pillow and fired a second time, this time killing her. After it was over, Frank gathered a few items from the home, about $200 in cash, a fan, and a wallet. Then he walked out into the night, convinced that no one would ever connect him to what he had done. But he was wrong. The next morning, when Edward failed to show up for duty at Eglin Air Force Base, his superior, Sergeant John Calloway, drove out to check on him. When he arrived, he knocked on the door, but there was no answer. Then he noticed the door was unlocked. He stepped inside and almost immediately realized something was terribly wrong. In one of the bedrooms, he saw a woman lying face down on the ground, motionless. He didn't go any further. Instead, he immediately backed out and called the police. When investigators arrived, they carefully searched the home. They found Anne first, shot in the head twice. In the second bedroom, they found Edward on the floor, nude, with his feet tied with a curtain cord and part of the same cord fastened to his wrist. He had been shot 3 times, and his throat had been cut. The investigation moved fast, and although Frank didn't know it yet, the walls were already starting to close in. His behavior had changed in the days after the crime, subtle things at first. Nervous pacing, strange comments, a tension that hadn't been there before. His roommate noticed it almost immediately, and the more he thought about it, the more it bothered him. So, the day after the bodies were discovered, he walked into the sheriff's office and told detectives there was someone they needed to look at. He told them his name was Frank, and just like that, the direction of the investigation changed. That single tip was enough to bring them to Frank's trailer. Before the sun went down, they took him into custody, and by the end of the day, Frank was charged with everything the detectives could put on paper: 2 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of kidnapping, armed robbery, burglary, grand theft, and possession of stolen property. When investigators searched his trailer, the picture became even clearer. Inside, they found items taken from Edward and Anne's home: the oscillating fan, the wallet, and the $200 in cash Frank thought would never be traced back to him. But that wasn't all. What detectives uncovered went far beyond stolen property. They also found an arsenal of weapons: ice picks, knives, a .22 caliber pistol, bullets, 8 more .22 caliber pistols, a holster, a box cutter, a rubber-handled hatchet, pornographic material, a chainsaw, a pair of burnt boots, 4 telephones, 2 other fans, 2 lawnmowers, and 93 articles of clothing, including a pair of bloodied jeans. Tools that raised serious concerns about Frank's past and his intentions. The search made one thing clear: this wasn't someone who had simply lost control once. And when the interviews began, Frank didn't deny what he had done. He straight up admitted to the killings inside that mobile home. But for detectives, that confession wasn't the end of the story. Because for years, investigators in Okaloosa County had noticed a disturbing pattern. Cases with the same kind of brutality, the same late-night break-ins, the same style of attack. So, while Frank sat in a cell waiting for trial, the sheriff's office pulled together a special team to reopen every unsolved murder in the county. And almost immediately, their focus locked onto one case above all others: the killing of Audrey Gigi. When detectives searched Frank's trailer again, they found a fan that matched one taken from Audrey's home years earlier, and on its surface was a single fingerprint. Lab tests later confirmed it belonged to Audrey herself. And with that, it became clear that the man sitting in that cell wasn't responsible for just one night of violence. He had been leaving a trail behind him for years, and no one had connected them until now. Frank had moved through Okaloosa County like a shadow. Between 1985 and 1987, he drifted from one crime to the next, breaking into homes, stealing what he could, and watching people who never realized they were being targeted. To most, he looked harmless, a quiet, skinny dishwasher from Ocean City who kept his head down and stayed to himself. But beneath that calm surface, something darker had been growing for years. The trail stretched all the way back to March 26, 1985, when Frank was just 17 years old. That day, he was completing community service hours on Okaloosa Island. The beach was almost empty, but nearby, 19-year-old Tommy Lou Whidden was sunbathing on her towel, alone, and unaware that she was being watched. Frank observed her from a distance, then made a decision that could never be taken back. He approached with a knife in his hand and cut her throat, leaving her bleeding on the sand. He then took her car and abandoned it behind a building. Her body was found later that evening by someone walking along the shoreline. But without any witnesses or leads, there wasn't much detectives could do. But it didn't end there. A year later, on September 16, 1986, it happened again. This time, the victim was 24-year-old Cynthia Sue Condra. She was found on the side of a rural road, stabbed 21 times. No one knew why he picked her. No one even knew he had done it. And that case, too, quickly went cold. By 1987, Frank had still not been caught, and with each passing year, he grew more confident. On May 20th, he broke into a mobile home near Fort Walton Beach and found 47-year-old Audrey Gigi alone. What really happened inside that home was unclear, but investigators believe he raped her, then left, only to return shortly afterward to finish what he started. Audrey never stood a chance. When her co-workers realized she hadn't shown up for her shift at the Keltec plant, they called for a welfare check. Officers entered her home and found her nude body on the floor, stabbed repeatedly. Some of her belongings were missing, but the person responsible was already gone. For years, these three murders remained unsolved as separate cases with no obvious connection. They sat quietly in evidence files while Frank moved through Okaloosa County unnoticed, breaking into homes, watching people, and taking small things he didn't even need. All of it stayed hidden. Until July of 1987, when Frank committed the crime that finally exposed him and brought the past rushing back into the light. By the summer of 1988, Okaloosa County had heard more than enough details to fill every front page. The evidence for the murders on Edgar and Ann was overwhelming, so prosecutors decided to try that case first. And when Frank's trial finally started on July 15th, there was no doubt about what the state was seeking. From the very start, prosecutors made it clear they were asking for the death penalty. The photographs were difficult to look at, and the story laid out in the courtroom was so disturbing that jurors struggled to hide their reactions as the days went on. But the trial didn't last long. After just 6 days, the jury reached a verdict. Frank was found guilty on both counts of first-degree murder. Then, on August 25th, the judge delivered the outcome. Frank would be sentenced to death for the murder of Ann Peterson and life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years for the murder of Edward Alger. For many, it felt like the case was finally over. But for Frank, it wasn't. He and his attorneys immediately pushed for a new trial, arguing that earlier hearings about his mental competency had been handled improperly. The case made its way to the Florida Supreme Court, and in a surprising turn, the justices agreed. The convictions were thrown out. The court ordered the entire case to be retried, this time in a different city, Mariana, far from the coastal headlines and public outrage that had surrounded the original trial. And just like that, what everyone thought was finished was suddenly wide open again. But even with a new setting and a fresh jury, nothing changed. In July 1992, after hearing all the evidence again, the verdict came back the same. Guilty on all counts. And Judge Barron, standing behind his original decision, reinstated the same sentences he had handed down 4 years earlier. But even then, the story wasn't finished. Investigators were still looking closely at other unsolved murders, especially the killing of Audrey. And less than a year after the second trial, Frank's past finally caught up with him in a new and undeniable way. This time it wasn't testimony or circumstance, it was DNA. Quietly, investigators retested evidence from Audrey's case, and when the results came back, they pointed straight to Frank, sealing what many had long suspected and tying him even more firmly to a trail of violence that stretched back years. And with that, the full scope of what Frank had done was finally coming into focus. Frank could see where this was headed: another trial, another flood of evidence, and very likely another push for the death penalty. And this time, the science would speak louder than anything he could say. So instead of rolling the dice again, Frank made a calculated move. He pleaded no contest to the murder of Audrey, and at the same time, he admitted responsibility for the killings of Tommy Lou and Cynthia. In exchange, prosecutors agreed not to put him through additional trials for those cases. It wasn't remorse, it was damage control. But even that didn't end the questions. Roughly a month after that plea deal, sheriffs in Walton County announced they were investigating Frank for yet another murder, this one involving 35-year-old Lindsay Sams, a woman from Mississippi who had been staying at a condo in Miramar Beach. In October 1986, Lindsay had been beaten so severely that even after she clung to life long enough to reach a hospital in Memphis, she never recovered enough to tell investigators what had happened. She died without giving investigators a single lead. When detectives tried to question Frank about Lindsay Sams, he shut down completely. He wouldn't explain. He wouldn't offer theories. Instead, he told investigators he felt betrayed. There had been too many headlines, too many leaks, and too much attention on what he had already admitted to. And because of that, he refused to say a single word about this case. So for years, the truth stayed just out of reach. Suspicion never went away, though. FDLE agent Dennis Haley later said Frank had long been considered a strong suspect in Lindsay's murder. But as time and no new evidence surfaced, investigators were forced to face a difficult truth. Frank's silence wasn't taking them any closer to answers. And so, rather than letting the case go cold, they widened the circle. They began looking beyond Frank himself toward the people closest to him at the time. That shift brought their attention to Mark Reeb, the stepfather of Frank's girlfriend at the time. And this wasn't some random turn. Mark already had a violent past. He and his brother had already been convicted in another similar killing and were serving life sentences. And for a while, that history seemed to point the investigation in a new direction. Then, in the mid-1990s, something unexpected happened. Inside a prison Bible study room, Alex, Mark's brother, broke down. In front of other inmates, he confessed to something they couldn't ignore. He said he had helped kill a woman. Word of the confession spread quickly, and before long, detectives were listening as Alex told a story darker than anyone anticipated. And at the center of that story was one familiar name: Mark Reeby. According to Alex, the brothers went to a small convenience store in Gulf Breeze on August 16, 1989. The plan, he said, was supposed to be simple, a quick robbery. But when investigators walked inside, something didn't add up. The clerk's purse was still sitting on the counter, untouched. Investigators would later note that it didn't even look like any money had been taken. What was taken was far worse. That night, 29-year-old Donna Callahan lost her life. She was in the early months of her second pregnancy. To this day, each brother blames the other for what happened next. But what investigators know for certain is this: Donna's body was buried in the woods, just steps away from the Reeby's family's property in Defuniak Springs. Years later, Alex led detectives straight to the spot where her remains were hidden. When the case finally went to court, both brothers pleaded no contest to avoid the death penalty. Not long after Mark began serving his 25 to life sentence, he reached out to his mother and sister with a disturbing message. He told them to reach out to investigator Dennis Haley immediately. In his words, "It will be mind-boggling what I'm about to tell him." Then came the confessions. Mark began talking about more killings, 12 more, each one worse than the last. But just as quickly as he confessed, he took it all back. He denied it, then hinted again, then went silent. For years, Mark kept playing games, never truly admitting how many women he may have killed. Investigators believe the true number of his victims is still buried, hidden in cold cases that remain unsolved, and in answers Mark may never fully give. Neither Mark nor Frank was ever charged in the murder of Lindsay Sams, and while her case remained unresolved, Frank's story was quietly approaching its final chapter. After decades of trials, retrials, and failed appeals, his time ran out. The legal road he had traveled for years came to a stop. And at last, the state set a date. Frank's execution was scheduled for December 18, 2025. That morning, Frank woke up at 5:10 a.m. and remained calm and compliant throughout the day. For his final meal, he requested chicken, steak, a baked potato, and cheesecake. He later met with one visitor and a spiritual advisor. In the days leading up to his execution, Frank's faith was unshakable. He explained it in simple terms. Either the Lord will grant me a stay and let me live to continue to spread His word, or the Lord will welcome me home. Throughout his nearly 40 years on death row, Frank had leaned heavily on his Catholic faith. In those final hours, that faith became his anchor, the one constant he had held on to through decades of confinement, appeals, and waiting. Then the moment came. Frank was strapped to the gurney and asked if he had any final words. He paused, then thanked the execution team for allowing him to speak. His voice was calm as he addressed the room. "Good evening, everyone," he said. "I appreciate the opportunity to say what's on my heart. If any members of the family are here, I am sorry for all of the things I did, the pain I caused, and all of that you have suffered all these years." Moments later, the process began. A priest stood at his side, holding his hand. Throughout it all, the priest prayed softly. At first, Frank's breathing was heavy, but as time passed, it gradually slowed and grew calm. At 6:11 p.m., a physician entered the room. He checked Frank's eyes, then listened carefully for a heartbeat. After a brief pause, he stepped back and spoke the words that marked the end. The execution had been carried out. Frank became the 19th person executed in Florida this year, more than doubling the state's previous record of 8 executions in a single year. Frank Athen Walls was 58 years old. That concludes all executions carried out in December 2025. If you liked this video, make sure to check out the next one, because just when you thought it couldn't get worse, well, it can. And the next cases are even more disturbing.